Here's a puzzle. It seems like death is bad for us. It's one of the worst things that can happen to us, or maybe the worst thing. But when we die, we're not around to experience the badness of death. So it seems different than other sorts of bad things that can happen to us. After all, when we break our arm or if our partner breaks up with us, those feel bad, but death doesn't feel like anything. We're not around to experience it. So how can death be bad? The question of why death is bad for the one who dies is actually a really old puzzle. The philosopher Epicurus, who died in 270 BCE, had an argument about the badness of death. He actually thought that we're mistaken when we think that death is bad. We're just confused about it, and he gave us a pretty simple argument. When we're alive, death hasn't happened yet, and so there's nothing to worry about. We shouldn't worry about something that hasn't happened. But when we're dead, we don't exist. And if we don't exist, nothing can be bad for us. So we just shouldn't worry about death. Do you feel better? To make sense of this question, it's useful to think about harm more generally. So there are some things that make our well-being go up and other things that make our well-being go down. If you eat some ice cream or get a promotion at your job, great, your well-being goes up. But if you get stung by a bee or you get fired from your job, your well-being goes down. Not great. We could measure these changes in well-being over the length of time of your life, and we could figure out how great the harm is by comparing where you actually end up on the graph versus where you would have been had you not had the thing happen to you. So to figure out how bad the bee sting is for you, we can just compare the difference between what your well-being would have been at had you not been stung versus where you're actually at because of the bee sting. This is called a counterfactual. We think about what things would have been like had the actual situation not happened. Here's why death is weird. When you die, if we assume that there's no afterlife, you don't experience death. This is unlike other sorts of things that happen to us in our lives. When we die, there's just nothing. So it's not that your well-being level has gone down, it's that your well-being level no longer exists. You're off the graph. Epicurus thought that something could only be bad for you if you experienced it. This is why he thinks that death isn't bad for us, because we don't actually experience death. We can experience dying, which can be bad for us. It can cause us pain and so on. But death itself, says Epicurus, isn't bad because we don't experience it. This claim that Epicurus is making is sometimes called the experience condition. It says that in order for something to be good or bad for you, you have to experience it. There has to be some change that happens to you. And so to figure out this question, we can think about, is the experience condition true? Many philosophers, and just like intuitively, people think that although experiences play a role in our well-being, that's what the ice cream and bee sting examples show, that there are other situations where even if we don't experience a change in well-being, something can still be harmful to us. So imagine this kind of scenario. You've applied for a job or an award or some other sort of thing, and I hack into the system for the award, and I change the results so that you were going to win, but instead I change it so you don't win. You never find out that I did this. You never find out that I hacked the system, and nobody else ever knows. I just changed the ordering on the list. Have I harmed you? I think most people would say, yes, you were going to win this award, but I made it so that you didn't win it. And so counterfactually, the difference is that you're now worse off than you otherwise would have been. But importantly, your well-being level doesn't actually change because you never found out about the hack and you never found out about that you were going to win the award. So your well-being level would just keep going the same as it was going before. This is a sort of example that can show how the experience condition might not be true in every kind of situation. It seems like in that situation, you've been harmed, but it doesn't result in a change in your well-being, which means that the experience condition seems to be false. This can help us make some progress on the question of how death can be bad. So we can once again appeal to counterfactuals. So imagine that there's a graph that we could make of the well-being of your entire life. The time of your life is on the x-axis, and the well-being level is on the y-axis. And there's a zero, a middle point. If you're above the middle point, if you're above 0, then that means that you have a positive amount of well-being. The goods in your life outweigh the bads in your life. And if you have a negative amount, then that means the opposite. You have a negative level of well-being, the bads outweigh the goods. We could, in theory, graph every person's life depending on their well-being level. And people's well-being will go up and down throughout their lives depending on how much ice cream they get or how many bee stings they get. And we could, in theory, graph those changes. Now, there's this question about what 0 actually means. And one way of thinking about it is that it's the point where life would no longer be worth living because the amount of bad that's happening when you're below the axis outweighs the amount of good. Exactly where this point is, what it would take to be at this point, is an important question for ethics, but it's not one that we really have to deal with in this video. It's just enough to have the idea that the bads can outweigh the goods. Most philosophers think that the badness of death is explained by something called the deprivation account. So if you imagine somebody who's living her life and she's above the x-axis, her life is going well, and then if she dies, then she no longer continues to get the good things that she would have had. She's being deprived of the good things that she would have got counterfactually had she kept living. This, philosophers say, is why death is bad, because compared to the situation where that person kept living, she now has less well-being across her whole life than she would have had she kept living. So death isn't bad in the way that, say, pain from a bee sting is bad. When you get stung by a bee, it hurts. That is intrinsically bad for you, and that's what makes your well-being go lower. But death doesn't have any kind of intrinsic feeling at all. You just miss out on good stuff that you otherwise would have had. But there's an implication of this. The deprivation view says that death is bad when you miss out on good things that you would have had. But so far we've only been assuming that the person is above the x-axis. That is, that the goods in her life outweigh the bads. But imagine somebody who's below the x-axis. The bads of his life outweigh the goods. Maybe he's experiencing a lot of suffering due to a disease, or maybe just all of the things in his life are going badly in various ways, and there's no chance that they're going to improve. In this case, the deprivation view says that death would actually be good for him, because as with the person who, if she dies, she misses out on the good things she would have had. For the person who's below the x-axis, if he dies, he's going to miss out on the bad things he would have had. And so death can actually be good for him. This is how we can make sense of somebody who, say, has a terminal illness and is at the end of his life, and he's tried a bunch of aggressive treatment and it's not working, and his suffering continues, and he makes a decision that he doesn't want to keep doing aggressive treatment. Instead, he wants to switch to just being comfortable to try to deal with his pain for palliative care. In this sort of case, his saying that he wants to die sooner can actually make sense because the bads in his life outweigh the goods. So it can be a rational decision, and death could actually be a good thing for him. Of course, it would be better if he wasn't in that situation. Better if he didn't have the illness that was causing the suffering, or better if he could deal with all the other things that would make life tolerable. But that's just not the case for many people. Epicurus thought that death can't actually be bad for us since we don't experience death. But we've seen that most philosophers think that death is bad because it deprives us of good things that we would have kept experiencing. It's not the case that death itself is intrinsically bad in the way that pain and suffering are bad. Instead, it's bad counterfactually because we miss out on good stuff. That doesn't mean that every death is bad. Sometimes death can actually be good. And this is an implication that Epicurus doesn't seem to have realized. So Epicurus thinks that death can never be bad, so there's nothing to worry about. But if the experience condition is necessary for well-being, then that also means that death can never be good. So if you imagine somebody who's just living the worst possible life, has a terminal condition, who's experiencing intolerable suffering, or even worse, is being tortured, or something like just the worst possible thing that you can imagine, Epicurus would say that death can't be good for that person, since when you die, you don't experience anything, and nothing can be good for you if there's no you anymore. But it's just totally implausible to think that somebody in that situation can't be benefited by dying. The whole basis of palliative care, of assisted dying, and of other things is that death can sometimes be positive for us. When somebody dies after a long drawn-out disease and people say, like, thank goodness that was a good thing, that is resting on the idea that death can actually come as a positive, and Epicurus can't make sense of that. So his view is implausible when we consider it kind of flipped over. Taking all of this into account, we get to the following conclusion. To the question, is death actually bad for us? The answer is sometimes.